Okay, we've made it through our first 6 months of the game, and this is our first kind of milestone in some respects. And this will be a fairly brief business report because there's not a huge amount to report this turn, I'd suggest. In terms of our military deployments, they're largely set now. We've got our kind of irregulars and a couple of smaller regular forces fanned out across the Balkan Peninsula. We've got the Second Army under Abdul Karim Nadir Pasha in Sofia. To intervene. I sort of didn't mention last time we've got Omar Pasha based in Smyrna with one cavalry division, and he can intervene in sort of western or central Anatolia in the event of any kind of any sort of dramas there. And you can kind of see the logic now of our sort of paramilitary deployments behind the front lines, guarding the mountain passes, ensuring that our army, the Fourth Army on the frontier, and Abdi Pasha, doesn't become enveloped by any kind of insurgency or anything like this. And we have our sort of forces already set in the Middle East. We've got Hussein Abdi Pasha in Baghdad, one infantry division. This is a less mobile force, but we have access to the river, which means we can move quite quickly in and around Iraq. And then we've got, of course, Khurshid based in Damascus. This is the infantry division and supply train that we kind of retrieved from Aden. I'm not quite yet decided what to do with that. My thinking is that there's a possibility that we can deploy this in Tripoli and then move the kind of mixed forces that we have, the kind of mixed brigades where we've got an infantry and a cavalry brigade, to Benghazi and Cyrenaica, just to firm up our position a little bit in Libya. I'm going to give that a little bit of thought. We can see the presence of a Prussian mission that's being set up in Tobruk. In Cyrenaica. That's nothing too much to be concerned about. I mean, this colony, well, it's not a colony yet, it is a protectorate. So in the event even of dramatic Prussian colonial penetration, they would not be able to now do much to stop this converting this territory, sort of becoming a colony in the long run. In terms of our military deployments, that is it. We have had our first taste of blood, our first combat experience. Now, we received a report about a month ago of some pirate activity in the central Mediterranean, which I thought was interesting. So, not knowing the size of this force, I thought we can kind of combine it with a bit of a training operation, a bit of a kind of shaking down sort of sail tour. So I decided to sortie my main fleet into the central Mediterranean. Now, about a fortnight ago, we spotted the pirates in the Ionian Sea, but in fairly heavy weather we're not able to engage, and in the last 2 weeks we've engaged that force and destroyed it. It was a very small force. There was no real threat to us. It was two Dhow raider ships. So these are, given that they are Dhows, they almost certainly come from North Africa, possibly Tunisia, possibly even pirate enclaves in Tripoli somewhere. But they've been dealt with, and we're actually going to bring the fleet back to Constantinople now. That's a job well done. There was no loss of life on our part, and pretty easy intervention there. In terms of military, then that's it. Now, in looking at our economic activity, I should point out one thing. I neglected to mention that in the first quarter we did lose an inflation point, which is good. Inflation declining is absolutely something that we want. Inflation can be incurred in different ways, and it's something we need to keep an eye on, especially in a fast-growing economy. And of course, that is our plan, to develop very, very rapidly in a very short very short space of time, try and get as many enterprises sort of set up as possible. Now, inflation can be incurred when we spend more private capital. Rather, we spend so much private capital in a turn, perhaps building an agricultural enterprise or a factory or a railroad, that when we pass turn, we don't have sufficient capital for the operational costs of our economy. On that basis, our capitalists will be compelled to borrow money, and that can incur inflation. The other thing that can incur inflation is flooding our economy with gems or gold. Flooding our economy with gems or gold is good insofar as it will provide us with a good source of private capital. These things will always sell on the domestic market, but they sell in very, very small quantities, and that which is left will be converted into state revenue. If that's done excessively, if you have a very if for example a country like Mexico, which has huge indigenous access to gold, if all of this gold were exploited by the Mexicans, they would probably seek to not convert this into state revenue, or not excessively anyway, because this would create huge amounts of inflation. So it's another way that inflation could be caused. The other way that inflation can be caused is through economic crises. An economic crisis can be triggered by any country, and it basically happens when there is the catalyst for an economic crisis is when there is too great a concentration of capital. So if, for example, the markets become saturated, it's no longer possible, really. There's no kind of profit motive in building a new factory, in opening up some kind of new agricultural enterprise, because demand is met. More goods are being produced than can be sold. Then capitalists begin basically just hoarding capital. It's not reinvested. There are no kind of opportunities really for them to do that. Then capital just starts building up and accumulating. There's a probability each fortnight that can trigger an economic crisis. An economic crisis can vary in intensity. They almost always result in an increased inflation, maybe sometimes by 2 or 3 points, or 4 or 5 points. They can last anything from 6 months to many, many years. And as you can imagine, the bottom falls out of the market. Your capitalists start hemorrhaging private capital very quickly. This compels them to borrow in order to cover their operating costs, and that in turn leads to further inflation. So they're the ways that you can get inflation on the basis of healthy growth for a sustained period of time, where you don't have any of these kind of problems. You have economic sunrise events where gradually inflation is kind of declines. Now, since the beginning of the building of our cereal farm back in March, we've had such a consistent source of private capital that we've extended this operation to a fishing port in Constantinople, an additional cereal farm in Adrianople, and our first tobacco plantation. Now, when we look at our assets balance, we can find tobacco. It doesn't matter how many years you play this game, every time I open my assets balance, I have to stare at it for ages in order to actually find the commodity. Let's have a look. Here we go, tobacco. Now if I hover over tobacco, we can see that the only sources of import for this commodity, if we wanted to, is from Chesapeake, which is the eastern United States, eastern American seaboard, southern Brazil, and the Caribbean. And these things are only sold in a very modest quantity. And if we further look in the kind of tooltip that sort of pop up, we can see the demand. So in Chesapeake Bay, there is a demand for 91 sort of units of this commodity. This is how many countries are basically putting in a demand for imports, overlapping demands. But supply is only 22. In South Brazil, demand is at 20, supply is 5. In the Caribbean, it's 3. Demand is only 4. What this says to us, of course, is that demand for this commodity far outstrips the global economy's capacity to supply it at the moment. You know, tobacco is very, very fashionable in the 19th century, and remains so into the sort of late 20th century. So this is definitely a commodity that we're going to exploit. It's going to be some time before we're going to be in a position to export this, maybe a year or so, maybe longer. But we have good indigenous access to tobacco, so we plan to exploit this, and this is going to be our kind of export cash crop, because there's going to be consistent demand for the foreseeable future for this commodity. So we've begun the building of our first tobacco plantation. We still have to bear in mind, we have to sort of be a little bit kind of sober in some regards. When we consider our economy, even though we are growing, we're starting to lay the kind of foundations for a capitalist agricultural economy. We have to keep in mind that the capitalist part of our economy, that is to say the economy that is based on these kind of enterprises, these RGOs, still only represents a small fraction of our actual economy. If we look, for example, at cereals, only 3 units of cereals are produced in RGOs, in capitalist enterprises. But if we look at various constructions and various 14 units are produced based on a kind of, not feudal economy, because you wouldn't really say the Ottoman Empire had a feudal economy, but in the kind of early modern economy, the kind of off-map economy that exists. It's not represented by any units or structures. It's sort of, if you like, the kind of 3-tier system of agriculture that you had in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. That's just one example. So our first aim with regard to economic development really is to supplant this mode of production, is to at least equal the amount that is produced in the kind of guilds, if you like. And this covers over also into, for example, fruits, We don't have any structures producing fruits at this moment, but our craftsmen are producing 15 units of this, So it's going to take some time, and certainly with the development of the railroad. The railroad really benefits agriculture as well. The development of the railroad will kind of animate and sort of, I suppose, kind of breathe life into these enterprises as well, because it means that we can move the commodities to ports very quickly and so on and so forth. That's it in terms of economic development. There's nothing else to report. Just quickly looking over at our kind of colonial map mode then, we can see that we're building our first trade post, and we're also building a mission in Qatar, and we've sent missions, we've sent a colonial trade post team, and so we're beginning to do the same also in Bahrain and Dubai. And Kuwait was a success. Of course, I mentioned we move our cavalry brigade south from Baghdad just to overwatch the transition of Kuwait into a protectorate, and that is now the case. The British did build a mission there, and that mission instantly created quite a lot of colonial penetration for them, 27%, but that ship has already sailed. They can no longer obstruct the transition from an influenced territory to protectorate. And furthermore, once it's a protectorate, it already has international recognition as being kind of within our sphere. It means that it's guaranteed that we have military control over the region unless there is an insurgency there, and the British can no longer obstruct the process of this becoming a colony. The only thing that obstructs it now is our level of colonial penetration, which will take some time. But we've built a consulate there now, so we can say that Kuwait is halfway in the bag, and there's nothing anyone could really do to take it out. That's it in terms of our sort of colonial operations, and there's nothing else to report that I can think of. It's the first 6 months in the bag. It's been a really good start, I think, for the Ottoman Empire. We've started building kind of agricultural capitalist enterprises in the centre around Constantinople and Edirne, and we will continue to do that in the next few months when we sort of meet back up in September 1850. We'll hopefully have built another couple of agricultural enterprises, and I'll see you then. I hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you next time.